Hello.
Welcome. Get back in. How are we going?
Yeah. The question is where to start.
Go. Go, chef.
I don't know. How do you start a conversation about it? About the
How is
two
it that
truths?
we...
Why were we talking about it?
Yeah.
Oh, I remember. Because I think it was something you wrote in Common Sense. I can grab it.
If you want.
Yeah.
You remember where it is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Vaguely. Oh, yeah, I remember. Okay.
Well, so as not to keep anyone who's listening bored, we are going to talk about absolute versus relative today.
Okay, here it is. This is in like the last chapter of the book. When we say tradition, what we actually mean is an unbroken line of pioneering death killers who succeed in uniting the state of death to the state of life. Or in other words, unite the absolute and the relative.
Okay.
And I read that maybe last week.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember saying to you in the car or something, like, I had never heard it, like, said that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seemed like there was a lot to unpack about it.
Mm-hmm. They said give this, they said, quote unquote, use this analogy this morning. We have an experience of going to work, for example. Eat, wake up, maybe go to the gym, eat, take a shower, get dressed, pack your bag, get in the car, drive, park, get out of the car, go in, say hi to someone, set your bag, it's like there's an experience of going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an experience of, let me slow down because this is important. There's an experience of going to work. We all have the experience of a day off. I don't know. The experience of going to school.
Mm-hmm.
The experience of going to shop for kale. I don't know, right? And then there is an experience of the nature of work itself. Mm-hmm. Then there's an experience of the nature of going to work itself as something fundamentally different than the experience of going to work.
So
the experience of the nature
mm-hmm.
of work itself and the experience of the nature of going to work
mm-hmm.
itself. Fundamentally different things.
Mm-hmm.
So, with respect to absolute and relative, so no matter how efficient or proficient I become at like taking a shower and cooking my eggs,
mm-hmm.
no degree of exercise or refinement with respect to driving my car or even being an expert in my field. No amount of development in the relative can assist me toward the experience of the nature of the relative.
Mm-hmm.
This is the fundamental difference. So there has to be introduced a different, in Gurdjieff's terms, there has to be a shock to that basic system, or in yogic terms, an entire different series of contemplations and series of exercises. And now I'll throw one other idea your way, and then I'm curious where we're going to go. But this is the basic difference between the exoteric and the esoteric. Is the pain of the realization of the unfulfillment, the unfulfilling, unsatisfying nature of mastering the relative world, finally. That makes us ask, with single-pointed focus, what the fuck is the point of this shit? Then someone is ready to, is only then really ready to explore something. Or let's say, in traditional Buddhist terms, the Buddha, quote unquote, the historical Buddha, was literally, according to the tradition itself, was literally the most highly evolved alien who was literally the most highly evolved alien teacher at the most poppin' Dharma center in the all universes, who incarnated directly into the maximum possible affluence. The best looking harem, the most possible resources, one of the most powerful armies. Or in other words, it's not until somebody has mastered the relative world that person can then pursue insight into the nature of the world, into one's own nature, successfully, in other words.
Well, that definitely answers the question of why it matters to even think about it, or why anyone would be interested in it being the absolute side of the coin. Yeah.
Absolute and relative. So again, the tradition asserts what I'm about to say, but also common sense also asserts what I'm about to say. So, as we've said for years, we're importing systems. And because those systems are literally written in languages we don't speak, we have to go through middle men and women. We have to go through scholars. Now, scholars, by definition, are not rebellious, forest-wandering ascetics and or non-compliant, like starving artist types, like by definition. So there is a fundamental component to a legit yogi, let's say, or a legit spiritual aspirant. That is what I just said: non-compliant, rebellious, forest-wandering. That is an essential component for a successful for anyone who is a spiritual aspirant that's going to have success in the process. The other essential component is the scholarly component, for sure. So we're really only getting, when translations arrive in our, on our bookshelves, we're really only getting half the coin most of the time, because they're coming through scholars who, by definition, have not spent their entire lives also being, let's call it, ritual practitioners, like yogis, quote unquote, with a lowercase y, investigators, like experimentalists with exercises of things, which is the prerequisite for discovery. Anyway, so when we hear the word absolute and relative, and people are trying to understand how they fit together, absolute, well, if the absolute is really absolute, then you couldn't experience it because it's divorced. So when you hear absolute, what it means is just absolute relativity, and it's like, yeah, maybe, but what the point of the words absolute and relative, or the point of setting up that linguistic distinction, is to point out that no matter how masterful I become at driving my car, at cooking my food, at managing employees, at earning money, that's different. None of that is worth anything in the other domain, in the investigation of the nature of.
Mm-hmm. Well, because you just provided physical examples, but you could even still extend the metaphor into like the less physical things, like we would consider our emotions or our mental processes, to be somewhat internal to our experience. But even the mastery of those processes will not necessarily offer us insight into the nature.
It doesn't tell you who you are. No matter how masterful I become in the outer, or at governing my emotions, or at governing my mind, none of those have anything to do with the question of authentic identity. Who am I? Who are you? What is this? Yeah. So that's why I'm always toying around with the idea of making another book called, Who Sits in the Sky Throne? The Mystery and Revelation of Identity. I mean, that's what all of this is about, essentially. Mm-hmm. That's, Mm-hmm. So anyway, so my point is that the words absolute and relative are close enough to introduce us to the idea of what is trying to be taught. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And no legit, we can't really be 100% ready to dive into the absolute investigation, quote unquote, until we've mastered the relative. Because we have to, by definition, when we're seeking the path, we're doing that because we acknowledge that we want more out of life. Mm-hmm. We think that means more stability, to be able to attract a partner, to start a business. We think it means that. And so then we're off on our evolutionary trajectory, our evolutionary career. Mm-hmm. Literally starts once we try to make more out of ourselves and our experience. Mm-hmm. So that's fine. And then that goes for a while up to the point of us evolving to be some amazing alien on some amazing evolved planet, and getting the point of, oh, I understand that I can become as successful as I need to be in the world or in my relationships, but that is a fundamentally different. Those types of that mindset and those technical skills have nothing to do with the discovery of my identity, the discovery of your identity. Different. Mm-hmm. And that money doesn't matter how much money I earn. There's no what is it called when you change change dollars to pounds or something?
Like a currency exchange.
Currency. It doesn't matter. There's no. It's worthless. Mm-hmm. $1 billion in my bank account is worthless in my spiritual bank account. Mm-hmm. Now there are ways to transform, transmute, mm-hmm. but those are still within the domain of the absolute, quote unquote, as we're calling it. Mm-hmm. Now the good news is, again, according to the tradition and according to common sense, the good news is that, we're all going to become enlightened anyway. That's another conversation, but it's fine for now. Mm-hmm. Because it can be daunting to think, well, where am I? I don't know, what am I doing wrong, what I'm saying? So,
yeah, I feel like a natural question that comes up in this subject is what is the experience of the absolute like? Or we want to anticipate it or something, or we want to try to intellectualize the difference between the relative and the absolute?
Yeah. So for example, here. So let's try to just go step by step and then see if we can arrive, by inference or something. Again, because when we employ/deploy our own common sense, we can see that even if someone were to try to tell us, the experience of the absolute is like this, it's coming in the form of information and not in the form of experience, so it's pointless to even try to do that, actually. So going by inference, going by metaphor is better because it ignites our imagination a little bit, and that gets us closer than just hearing someone else's words.
Yeah, but really before we even go further along that path, I am curious whether it's helpful to think about that.
Yes, it is, because we have to try to start to see the fundamental differences, even in the, I use the word mindset, even in the way we're using our mind. There's a fundamental difference. So for example, let's take the analogy of going to work. Okay? You only need to know where you're going one time. In the absolute. In terms of there's a revelation of how to go about things, where to be, how to position yourself, how to act, in other words. You only need to know where to go and why you're going there one time. Right? But that's not enough. That means nothing in the relative world. It doesn't matter in the relative world that you know where you're going and why you're going there. You have to fucking do it every single day. Right? And in the relative world, there's no end. You know what I'm saying? As long as you have a physical body, there's something that you're going to have to do in order to take care of it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. There's no end at all.
Here's another analogy to illustrate your point.
Sure.
It's like in a theater, for example. Like, all of the actors could have memorized the script perfectly, but the play doesn't perform itself. Like, they have to show up and they have to speak the lines, and the audience is going to be there watching them perform actions.
Yeah. And if you recall, I think when we first brought this up, I was mentioning the gradual path. Yeah. Or in other words, or let me try to put, in a certain esoteric school of Buddhism, there's a contention that I support, that is, our movement toward total maturity happens in stages. Makes sense. And the final stage is called the path of no more learning. Because these ideas have been introduced to us so recently, meaning the idea of enlightenment or realization, a yogi's realization, we don't, we're not really sure how to interpret that word. Like, well, now it's all over, or I just poof, I disappear, or I need to leave my body, or, all the things that... Right, so there's language, again, specific language that's used to point us to an understanding of the concept itself, the path of no more learning. It's still a path. Meaning, and when you imagine a path, like I see like some type of walkway, like winding through some woods, and it's like going, So it's like the implication is that there's ongoing movement. There's imminent and indefinite movement required. However, there's nothing that isn't known about the nature of the movement, why we're moving. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was talking about, the union of the state of death with the state of life or whatever, something like that, I'm pointing to or trying or saying something along these lines. Yeah.
Can we go back to the gradual path?
Sure.
Because I wonder if it's important to distinguish between the gradual path and other schools of thought.
Well, here's what's interesting about... Sorry, I need some more coffee. We use the word lineage a lot. That's not something, again, that we're used to thinking about in the West. Like the Western mindset doesn't really... Like we embrace the word mentor basically only in professional settings. Like I look up to someone who has like all this money or some position, status, and I want to be like that person, and that person becomes my mentor and like teaches me something about how to become more masterful in the relative world. Better relationship, raise your kids, get your kid into this school, graduate from this school, go to this business school, get this extra degree, you understand?
Yeah.
Like that's our concept of mentor. But really, when I say lineage, obviously I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about investigation into the revelation of identity, who we are, what this is. So, in that domain, lineage means this is a recipe as to how these group of people got to this thing. And it's specific to them, and they know that because they've done that something. So and I'm saying that to say that I don't know, so it's because my lineage is that I don't know enough about the nuances of the other
Gotcha.
to really thoroughly like comment on it. What we're talking about now, there is literature about it. I have heard people talk about it, and as I've reflected on it, I can start to see the point of what they're saying.
Okay.
So there is the basic difference, and actually I don't think that they're different. So the basic what Ulani is asking about is that within the esoteric tradition itself, there's two general schools of thinking. One is what we're calling the gradual. The other is sort of like a spontaneous insight, spontaneous revelation tradition. Some teachers talk about, I don't know if this is we're going too like high level, losing whatever. That there is let's call it there is a layer of our mind that itself has to be accessed in order to experience. Or there's a layer of our being that itself has to be accessed in order to have the experience of the revelation itself.
Okay. And this is part of the gradual?
So this is how some unite both schools of thought. Some teachers will say that Ati Yoga, like in the Dzogchen Nyingma tradition. So the difference is that in that tradition, they place their thing as like above all these other things, like the unsurpassed, the unexcelled yogas. So like, you have the unexcelled, like Guhya Samaja is like a precursor to Ati in their tradition, which is older actually.
Yeah.
So this is why some teachers will unite the two as like that spontaneous revelation. It's not like you go from zero to spontaneous revelation. You go from zero through all of the tantras, and then that level of mind is accessed when you succeed in the unexcelled path. That level of mind is accessed, and that eye, let's say, opens, and you see like that and experience like that. But it's still gradual.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, and I think that a way to make this more accessible, just in common sense terms for anyone who's just getting used to these ideas, is that it's just pointing to cause and effect. It's reinforcing the idea that the universe is orderly,
Yes.
and that there has to be a cause for an effect.
Yes.
And if we're saying that a realization, quote unquote, is an effect, there has to be a cause for it, which means that there was a process and certain specific methods to get there. It's not just random.
Yes, it's not random.
Which means that a certain type of effort is required. And if we're going to know for certain what that method is, we should probably consult somebody who has practiced it.
Yes.
And then we come back to the idea of a real lineage and what it's founded upon.
Yeah. Definitely. Nothing to add to that.
Yeah, so even though we're using all these like fancy words and stuff, that's what we're really talking about.
Yes. Yes. We're really talking about a certain type of hunger that we're really talking about a yearning, a longing that only shows up once we've fully grasped that no matter how excellent we become in the relative world, quote unquote, none of that is going to satisfy that longing to really know this experience, the nature of this experience. Mm-hmm. There's an entirely different type of investigation, mindset, and exercises, let's say, that are required. That's all I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. And maybe there isn't that much more to say about this, but if there's one other analogy or example that I think is kind of fun to bring up, it's the one that you have sort of illustrated about either you use like the crowd in a sports event, or you use like photography as an example, like exposure.
Sure.
I don't know if either of those is better.
Do both of them.
Well, the other day when we were talking about this in the car, we were also using the words subjective and objective. Mm-hmm. And I like the photography example because I did a little bit of it, and like the old school, analog, where you have to go in the dark room and you're using light sensitive paper. And for example, there's a technique where if you layer a bunch of different film strips like on top of each other, then if you turn the light on and process it on that photosensitive, light sensitive paper, then eventually if you stack too many different film strips up, all you're going to get is white. Like it's just overexposed. Like all these different shots and frames and perspectives at once just produces white. Mm-hmm. Like total, what do you call it?
I don't know.
Like a whiteout. It's just, everything all at once.
Yeah, you just reminded me that you mentioned the two truths. So the absolute and the relative are called the two truths. And what it means is both are true at the same time. Mm-hmm. Right? So like again, going to work. Both are true at the same time. Like the knowledge of where to go and why I'm going there, and my role there.
Yeah.
And the doing of that over and over and over again. Both of those things are necessary, in other words.
Yeah.
And so, for example, both are true at the same time. The sporting of let's say an arena, a football game. Mm-hmm. There's a certain sound, like there's the relative truth of, let's say, the experience of being at a game, where you're literally, your team scores a touchdown and you're making noise.
Yeah.
And so is the person next to you, and you can kind of hear you're going, yeah, You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But if you zoom out all the way, let's say, or you put a microphone, as we do when we watch the TV, when we watch the same football game, or when we watch a football game on TV,
replay.
right?
Yeah.
And you zoom out and you hear every single individual's response at the same time. It just sounds like noise.
White noise.
You know? So because we've had the experience of being in a crowd, when we hear, we know what that means. Like, by our own experience of being immersed in a relative situation. Mm-hmm. When we hear the absolute of that, we know what it means. Mm-hmm. We know exactly what the fuck it means.
Yeah. And then the last example we were talking about in the car, about the distinction between subjective and objective, was using math. Mm-hmm. And so we were saying 1 + 1 = 2. And the fact that that is true from all perspectives. Yeah. If you ask anybody and they actually know the answer, everyone's going to say 1 + 1 = 2. Like, that is the same.
Yeah.
However, the subjective side of the coin is like, I'm sitting in this chair on this side of the table, and this is true for me, mm-hmm. but you're sitting in that chair on that side of the table, mm-hmm. and we're experiencing different perspectives. That's subjective.
Mm-hmm. No, well, I'm not sure what the point you're trying to make, but I think what I was saying when we were in the car is, for example, let's say, let's just say, for example, it's 8 a.m. and we're going to get in the car and we're on the road, mm-hmm. And it's like, I'm going to work, and so is, like, I'm going to work, and like, if I look in the lane next to me, someone would be like, I'm going to work, or something, mm-hmm. 1 + 1 = 2, for example, is true at a zoom out level. Mm-hmm. It's true, but its truth is really only embodied by somebody, mm-hmm. also by a person, and by everyone who realizes that.
Yeah. Well, the point I was trying to make was that subjective things are true individually, but objective truth is true in all cases. It doesn't matter who you are, 1 + 1 is always going to equal 2. But, it does matter who you are in terms of how you're experiencing the relative events of your life. We could all be going to work, but we're each having a very different experience and perceiving it in a unique way.
Sure.
Yeah. And the only, reason or importance of bringing that up, other than just philosophizing, is that oftentimes in these type of conversations, there is, a point of contention about the meaning of life, quote unquote. And some people will argue that, it's just subjective and, the meaning of life is whatever I want it to be. And so then there's that whole conversation.
Yeah.
But it's missing the acknowledgement of a distinction between subjective and objective, or in other words, the relative and absolute truth. So understanding absolute and relative truth distinctions will help us get on the same page about what is the point of life, how do we actually know that for certain.
Yes, I hear what you're saying. I agree. I mean, this, I think, is another conversation. Maybe, I don't know how much time how far are we gone? Yeah. Let's just keep going. If I'm hungry, the meaning of life to me is going to be to get food.
Totally.
And that might be different for someone who has a shitload of food and is bored. And the meaning of life for that person might be like, I'm trying to go to the club. Mm-hmm. Right? Okay. So when we talk about meaning of life, it's like it has to be more specific than that.
Sure.
Has someone, and yes, so that's that point. It has to be more specific when we're talking about the meaning of life. Mm-hmm. Someone's needs are subjective to them. Mm-hmm. That's different. Someone's aspirations might be subjective.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when we're talking about how we value and prioritize our thinking, like, I think what you're saying is maybe we would benefit by discussing more frequently with each other whether or not we should value and prioritize similar types of thinking, similar types of behavior. That's, another thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But with respect to the relative and the absolute, there's a way, there is a path for cultivating ourselves in our daily experience, and it's obvious that we would like to be as healthy as possible. We'd like to be as emotionally and mentally healthy as possible. When I say healthy, I'm obviously meaning physical. We would like to be as physically healthy as possible. We'd like to be emotionally and mentally healthy as possible. We would like to make as much money as possible. We would like our relationships to be as healthy as possible, right? But none of that has anything to do with the revelation of who we are and what this experience is. None of that really has to do with the revelation of our connection to each other, right? So there's a different set of things. Now, typically when we say meaning of life, the meaning of life isn't to get healthier in our bodies or minds. The meaning of life isn't to have a better relationship. The meaning of life isn't to improve our status. That's not the meaning.
Yeah.
When we talk about meaning. Really, that's why I've been substituting purpose for meaning. What is the purpose of your life? Why are you doing what you're doing, in other words?
Yeah.
This is better, closer.
Yeah.
Why are you doing what you're doing? Based on what evidence? What reasoning is behind your decision to act or think a certain way? That's a real...
Well, it's helpful at least to discuss this,
Yes.
because then we can be more deliberate and selective with the words that we're using to just communicate more clearly with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, this is good.
Yeah.
Thank you for the IDs.
Yeah, sir.
Sounds